we borrow from a lot of different, I guess, fantasy elements. We see more and more elements from DFS in terms of stacking and best
Mhm.
ball and that kind of thing creeping into redraft. One area that I think still needs a lot of work and still needs some attention in the dynasty space that I don't think enough attention and thought is put into is that how are you approaching your roster construction? How are you approaching your depth? Because I mean, I try and play in as deep leagues as possible. I don't like anything that's kind of shallower than sort of 25-man rosters and things like that. So you sort of think, oh, it's okay, I've got loads of roster spots, I can waste one on them. But how are you approaching the depth on your roster in a dynasty league? Have you got a specific way of approaching it, or is it just a case of if you think they're a good asset, you're happy to roster them?
It sounds like I don't have as strict a process that as the one you apply to your depth, and I'm eager to hear, about this process. For me, it really comes down to, again, what are my expectations, as to how I kind of lay out my roster. I do want to have enough depth in order to sustain key injuries. At the same time, I want to take swings to have that constant churn for value so that I have upside opportunity. So that all kind of comes into play as I'm going through the depth, and then it comes down to the competition. What does that look like? Who am I competing against? We talked earlier about how active the league is. Depth doesn't become quite as much a concern in an active league because I can move in and out. And it comes down to scoring system, because I think that plays into how you value your depth. You can talk about one quarterback versus two. You can talk about unique scoring, like something like the fishbowl in Dynasty, where you're getting extra points for maybe length of touchdown, or PPR tight end premium, or your 0.5 for wide receivers. All of that kind of comes into play for me because there's a valuation that's attached to league format and league scoring, along with depth of roster. In a 25-man rostered league, that changes the value of each one of those 25 players compared to a league where you're only carrying 18. And there's a much wider waiver pool available. So context matters. It'll be, chiseled into my gravestone, because it's one of the things that, I know fantasy and dynasty communities like to talk in vacuums, but dynasty specifically is truly built around context and specifics, whether it's league, whether it's scoring, whether it's value, and manipulating those markets is the key, as opposed to, just kind of running full bore and not really worrying about it too much. So long-winded answer, but that's it matters. It just isn't strict. It's really league specific, scoring specific, and kind of roster build specific as to how I would weigh each position with value.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to the point. It feels like this always comes completely full circle of every league is a microeconomy. How you're approaching those roster spots, how you're approaching it, depends on the league format, how your teammates approach their depth pieces and things like that. So yeah, I think utilizing and manipulating that kind of microeconomy is always going to be key in all of this. Yeah, I hinted before the show that I have quite a strict rule in terms of what I guess I class as my roster and what I class as kind of depth. So the way I approach it is I have what I class as my squad. So my squad is my starting positions plus one backup for every single position. So say I start 10, that could be two QBs, two running backs, three wide receivers. I'm trying to do maths off the top of my head. There would be three flexes, won't it? So I will then have those 10 players as roster spots. I will then have a backup quarterback, a backup running back, a backup wide receiver, and a backup flex. So my squad in that start 10 league is 14 players. And I will look to build the best 14-man squad as I can, because that's what I deem is enough injury replacement, is enough bye week replacement, that unless something drastically goes wrong with my season, I shouldn't really be looking outside of those 14 players week in, week out to tick the box to put them in my starting lineup. And then the rest of my roster is what I'm classifying as depth. So depending on where I'm at in the rebuild contention cycle depends on how I'm approaching that depth. If I'm a rebuilder, we talked about it earlier, I'm looking to embrace as much risk as possible. I'm looking for high upside options. I'm looking to churn those roster spots to try and, as soon as a player represents some value, I'm shipping them off, trying to build up and acquire value that way. If I'm a contender, it might be that maybe I want to stretch my 14-man squad out to maybe 16 players. Maybe I add another running back or another wide receiver that I feel just to give me a little bit more cover in case of those bye weeks or an injury or something like that. So I've got that extra potential flex starter or that extra depth running back. But again, outside of that, those end of roster spots are just looking to churn and gain value and ship them off for picks and acquire as much roster value as possible. I think where we can kind of get mistaken in the dynasty community certainly is something Ryan McDowell's talked about massively is that roster clogger mentality of we keep those players sat on the end of our bench just in case they turn into something in a year's time, in 2 years' time. The list of players that have broken out having had awful rookie seasons is pretty minuscule. The risk of players that have broken out after year 2, after year 3 is pretty tiny. If a player's not shown you anything to be in your squad in the first year or two, the chance of them being fantasy relevant is very small. The other thing I'd say is that in that depth piece, I'm tending to look towards what I class as volume-based positions. So I'm looking to attack quarterback and running back far more with my depth pieces than I am wide receiver and tight end. The reason being that I believe running back and quarterback are much more volume dependent for fantasy production than skill based. So if a quarterback gets injured, their backup quarterback suddenly becomes fantasy relevant. If a running back gets injured, their backup running back suddenly becomes fantasy relevant. Whereas if a wide receiver gets injured, the fourth string wide receiver doesn't suddenly become fantasy relevant. So I believe that those quarterback and running back positions I can then spin off for future value for picks when they do become future fantasy relevant. And therefore I can potentially look to upgrade my squad of 14. So I guess I appreciate, as I said, I'm quite kind of narrow-minded in terms of my approach of how I look at depth. I think that maybe it's spending too much time with Tom and his kind of roster management in terms of best ball and stuff like that. But do you think that there's anything out of that you would potentially pick out or kind of discuss?
Well, I really like that process. I think there's a lot of value there, and it makes a ton of sense. And blueprints matter, right? Having a process makes it sustainable. It matters. So I like that. The one thing I might add as kind of something that I would incorporate into that is prolific offenses and owning a share of that for future upside. So you talk about emphasizing and prioritizing quarterback, running back, but if I see let's talk about potentially the Green Bay Packers, right? Everybody's high on that offense with Jordan Love. They've got 4 wide receivers that are all kind of comparable in talent, whether it's Reed or Watson, Dubs, and then Dontavion Wicks, who is the cheapest of the 4 and maybe the most talented. So, in my opinion, there's an opportunity to churn that bottom of the roster, even though it's a position you may not prioritize. I want to be part of that prolific offense, not only prolific, but also a offense that has desirability from the community, because that's important, right? Because that's going to drive future valuation. Just like in Houston, everybody wanted to get part of that, the wide receiver core because of CJ Stroud and what he was doing his rookie season. Green Bay is going to be the same thing this year. Owning a part of that room matters. So I love your approach and having a kind of a line in the sand that's still adjustable, right? You're able to pivot if you need to. You're able to expand your core unit if you need to. You already have a mindset to churn that bottom part of your roster. You already have a positional focus on what you want that churn to be. Again, I like it. The only addition I might make is prioritizing some of those offenses that have that desirability in the community and the potential to give you that quick upside swing.
Yeah, no, I love it. And, you can take it even further with that Packers offense. You look at Luke Musgrave, you look at Tucker Kraft. I think both of those
Mm-hmm.
guys, if one of those guys ends up winning that role as this kind of 80-90% player, they're going to see a massive rise in value because they're a starting tight end in that offense. It, do you know which one it's going to be? I certainly don't. But I think if you
But
can
that's where the I didn't mean to cut you off, but that's where the variance comes in. What's the value, right?
yeah,
Right, because that's the swing you take. I think Musgrave will be the receiving tight end. I think Kraft will probably be more in line by my perception. But if I go into a league and I look at I look at the consensus rankings, and all of a sudden, if Musgrave is going 2 rounds later, Kraft is going 2 rounds later, well, that's your target because it's worth the swing.
yeah, 100%, 100%. And I think if you sit down with the depth chart, you can probably identify 6 or 7 of those
Mm-hmm.
high-profile offenses. Those are great players to go and target and attack. And you know, if we see injuries, if something happens in, let's say, the Carolina Panthers offense, are you really going to see a world where the wide receiver 4 in Carolina suddenly becomes fantasy relevant? Probably not. But there's absolutely a world where those depth pieces in Green Bay, in Houston, in Cincinnati, they could easily, jump out of nowhere and carve out a role. And I love the idea of going and targeting those high profile, high value offenses, because that's where fantasy points are going to be produced. Well, thank you ever so much for your time, Leo. It's been an absolute privilege to kind of pick your brains for the last 40 minutes or so. Remind everybody that is watching, if they've not come across yourself, come across your work, where can everybody find you?
So a couple of things, right? First, before we go into me, we talked a little bit about just Devi and what that looks like, and so I do a podcast every other Thursday with Kevin Coleman, and he's over at the Devi Royale, and they've got a great crew over there, Christian Williams and Jay Stein, and they do a great job. So I would encourage folks, if they're interested in Devi, to take a look at that and get a feel for what they offer. And definitely worth checking out their Discord and their Patreon. And then as far as I'm concerned, I'm on X or Twitter. You can find me at Ciga_FF, CIGA_FF. And obviously happy to answer any questions and interact with as many Dynasty folks as want to. And my written work and some other content you can find at Football Guys. That's where I'm calling home now. And so I've got some articles that drop there pretty regularly, and some roundtable discussions and some other content. So just find me at Football Guys.
No, absolutely. Look, I'm a huge fan of yourself, Leo. I'm a huge fan of the Devi Royale Football Guys. We've had Kevin on the show. We've had Jeff on the show last week. We've had Jay on the show with some rookie mock draft early in the year. So we're big fans of all of you and all of your work doing there. If you've not checked it out, go and do it now, because honestly, it will make you a far better fantasy player if you're reading and consuming their work. We'll be back very soon with more shows. If you've not hit that subscribe button, go ahead and do it now. If you made it this far, make sure you're getting more content coming into your ears.